Hey all! This is my general overview of Mythic Plus Halls of Infusion from the POV of a Casting Mistweaver. I've tried to note where I like my cooldowns, which mobs to prioritize for CCs and interrupts, and commonly unavoided damage that we shouldn't have to heal through, but probably will. As you work on the trash leading to Iridius, make sure you avoid Geomancer's Seismic Slam. This is where they leap onto a player's location, marked by a brown swirl. This is easily dodged, but it might be a one-shot if you get hit on a high enough key. The other thing you want to avoid is the Defender's Spear Flurry, which is a frontal targeted at the tank. It puts a pretty nasty bleed on anyone that gets hit, so it can be really nasty if paired with other damage, but everyone, including the tank, can sidestep it. Apart from tank damage, the majority of damage comes from Containment Apparatus. They'll cast Containment Beam on random targets, which is a channeled dot. This can't be interrupted, but stuns and other forms of CC do work. What you want to interrupt is Expulse, which is a massive burst of group damage that's likely a one-shot on high keys, especially fortified, or if anyone's already low from another source of damage. Especially on packs with more than one apparatus, don't be afraid to pop healing cooldowns to stay ahead of the damage. Iridius has a tank-facing frontal slam called Titanic Fist. Everyone including the tank can sidestep this, but hopefully your tank faces it away. Also dodge series of blue swirls on the ground, that's his Spark Volley, and if anyone gets hit and survives, it leaves a magic dot that you can dispel. He'll periodically cast Static Surge, which is just channeled group damage that ticks 4 times over a few seconds. I try and save Shilun's Gift or Yu'lon for each of these. Power Overload is when he applies magic debuffs to 3 players. These players need to move out to separate locations before these debuffs expire, since they leave behind a damaging power field. All 3 targets suffer damage from the dot itself, then from a couple ticks from the power fields after they expire and they have to run back in. So you've got a limited time to heal them up before the next static. Once the intermission begins, Iridius spawns adds you'll want to kill close to the boss to break his shield, while making sure not to stand in their explosion radius. They also put dots on random players that you should dispel whenever possible. I really like to use Yu'lon here, just to clean things up if the intermission starts to drag on for too long. When the final phase starts, the boss does more damage and his power fields have a bigger radius depending on how long you spent in the intermission. This is basically just a harder phase 1 for the rest of the fight, since the power fields are typically huge by this point, and players can easily die before they get out of them and back in healing range, unless they pop a defensive or a healing potion. On high keys, it's extremely important that these players are either fast to react or have some sort of movement to get out of the field as soon as possible, after their debuffs expire. Personally, I try and pre-position so I can dispel myself first and then return to the boss. That way I can get back to healing the other 2 sooner. Moving on to the next trash, avoid or interrupt the Dragonfly's Frontal Cone Dazzle, which is a disorient. Interrupt or purge Shock Trooper's Elemental Focus, otherwise their attacks transform into Chain Lightning, which means loads of frequent group damage that you shouldn't have to heal through. Zealots are stealthed mobs that stun and ambush their targets. Hopefully your tank or your group can flush these out before they jump you or someone else, but just keep them in mind and don't stray too far from the group if you're not sure if it's safe yet. Swoglets will fixate on random players and stack a poison that kills instantly at 10 stacks. Just dispel anyone at especially high stacks as needed, otherwise focus on kiting and healing. If things get messy, sometimes I'll pop a defensive and stand still if there's only 1 or 2 frogs fixated on me, so I can pump healing into everyone else while I dispel myself. Poison aside, the frog's melee attacks do still hurt. Before the next boss, there's a pair of mini-bosses. Make sure you stay out of Zyraz's Whirling Fury, dispel and avoid Amy's Molten Subduction, and interrupt her Cauterize so she doesn't heal. The Gulping Goliath occasionally casts Overpowering Croak, which does 3 ticks of group damage over a couple seconds, and spawns brown swirls on the floor for you to dodge, which then spawn Swoglets a moment later, which behave just like the trash. As long as everyone's topped off going into a croak, I like to save Shilun for this. That way I can hit it just after the 3rd and final tick, but before the frogs start attacking. Just like before, kite the Swoglets, but try and keep them near the boss so he eats them whenever he casts Gulp, which is an AoE circle around him. You want your tank to stand in this every time, since the boss enrages for a whole minute if Gulp doesn't hit a player, and if the boss does enrage, his physical damage increases, meaning the next Overpowering Croak will hit extremely hard, so be ready with defensives or a major healing cooldown if this happens. Otherwise, the boss occasionally channels Toxic Effluvia, which is 3 ticks of group damage over a few seconds. I try and save Yu'lon for this, but it's generally less dangerous than the Croak. The next trash is pretty simple, but can also be a little brutal, especially on Fortified. As far as what to avoid, Earthshakers will quake the ground. That's a brown circle on the ground for you to avoid. Pretty simple. Gale Singers create damaging fields of storm clouds on the ground, but they'll also pelt you with wind bolts, doing minor damage and a small knockback that actually interrupts your casts. Ice Callers cast Refreshing Tides, which is just an interruptible heal, and the Glacial Protodrake periodically casts Deep Chill, a burst of group damage that puts a dot on everyone. I try and alternate Shaloon's Gift and Yu'lon for each chill, but individual Dispels or Revival can help mitigate if nothing else is available. The Drakes also channel a Frontal Breath at the tank, which tracks and needs a bit of healing. The third boss, Kajin, deals heavy group damage throughout the entire fight, but if everyone does her mechanics properly, this should be the only real damage to heal through. Every time she casts Hailstorm, you'll want to line of sight using an uncracked ice block. Make sure you're away from any cracked ice blocks since they blow up when Hailstorm hits them, and even if you're safe behind an uncracked ice block, if there's a cracked one close enough, it can still blow up and kill you. Frost Cyclone targets a random player and shoots a cyclone in their direction, likely killing anyone that gets hit. Try not to bait these directly into ice blocks, especially the ones you plan to use for Hailstorm, because it will crack them. And Glacial Surge is basically Kurog's erupting bedrock from Vault of the Incarnates. Once the first ripple around her finishes, you can step there as the ripples travel outwards, one section at a time. Also worth noting, these Glacial Surges are actually what spawn the new ice blocks, so after this cast is when you should be looking for some fresh ones. On high keys, especially Tyrannical, this fight takes an extraordinary but consistent amount of healing, and I like to rotate Shaloon's Gift, Yu'lon, and a combination of smaller cooldowns, especially double instant enveloping mist from Thunder Focus Tea, to keep on top of it. I typically use Shaloon's at anywhere between 4 and 10 stacks, depending on how far behind I am on healing and how many healing amplifiers I have active. I haven't felt the need to dispel the boss's Frost Shock, but just be aware that's something she's casting occasionally on a single player at a time. The final trash is a Gauntlet, and apart from the Ice Callers, Earthshakers, and Protodrakes that you've already seen previously, there are Aquatic Ragers that have 2 casts. Boiling Rage, which is a small, interruptible enrage, and Tidal Divergence, which causes them to split into multiple adds if it's allowed to go off. The Ice Caller's heals and the Rager's Tidal Divergence should be your priority interrupts, otherwise just make sure you're avoiding the whirlpools that are coming down the path, and rotate healing cooldowns for each of the Protodrake's deep chills. The mini-boss Saria attacks once you've killed all the Ragers. Make sure you interrupt her Aqueous Barrier, dodge the AoE swirl around her when she casts Flash Flood, and continue dodging whirlpools. The last boss, the Primal Tsunami, periodically casts Tempest Fury, which is just a large burst of group damage. Since everything else is essentially avoidable, I just cast Shaloon's Gift to top everybody off afterwards, and I don't stress about it. Occasionally, globules spawn in random locations and under each player, and they hover around a bit before exploding in an AoE around them and then disappearing. This is 100% avoidable, but it's also where most of the avoidable damage on this fight comes from. At least, the avoidable damage that we have to heal through. The tank will occasionally get targeted with Squall, which knocks them back, followed by Focused Deluge, a channeled dot. I either focus heals on them or I cocoon them going into it, and if they fail to get back into melee range after the knockback, the boss will start swinging at other players, which can lead to a wipe really fast, so I like to back up a little bit until I make sure that they got back in. Watch out for if the tank gets knocked back into a globule, since that can get a bit dangerous to heal if you add that on to the deluge damage. When Phase 2 begins, your group gets split up and teleported to the ends of different hallways. Take your time getting to the end. It can get overwhelming with all the globules and the whirlpools, and since getting hit by either of these is likely a one-shot on high keys, I try and take my time and make it to the end safely, since there's really no need to heal at all during this part. The globules occasionally explode and disappear, just like they do in the regular phase, which gives you a small window of a few seconds when there's nothing to dodge except the whirlpools. Once you get back to the main area, you can CC one of the infuser adds and then join everybody else in killing off the remainder. The infusers cast Inundate, which can be prevented with stuns, knocks, and other forms of CC, and if it's allowed to go off, it'll bolt everyone in the group for a chunk of damage, so it's a great idea to hit healing cooldowns here if you're not taking it slow. The boss gains increasing damage the longer the infusers are allowed to channel, but especially if your group hard CCs some of them and handles them one or two at a time, there's really no rush since damage in the normal phase is mostly avoidable anyways. Once the infusers are dead, phase 1 begins again, and from there it's rinse and repeat until it's dead. And that's my overview of Halls of Infusion. I plan to make similar videos for the other dungeons as I gather enough gameplay footage, so make sure you stay tuned for those if you found this one useful. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and have a good one.